Let's get into the lesson and we'll talk about how to learn from this situation. And I'll give a general explanation of how you need to be careful with your third-party libraries and your frameworks. But we'll try and get through this pretty quickly. For those who actually want to really learn here, you might want to take some notes. I will basically share what I'm saying in the form of notes on the screen here for you. And we'll also look at a few examples from some libraries and some pictures and stuff, basically teaching tools. Okay, so let's start with third party. I basically defined this already, but let's just go over this one more time. Anything which is not part of your platform's SDK, like I said before, in that particular case, the Android SDK, or your language's standard library. If you've ever seen JSTD-lib, or however they choose to write it, this stands for Java Standard Library, and I totally misspelled it. JST, well, I guess I didn't. Yeah, JSTD-lib stands for Java Standard Library. So let's look at a couple examples just so that you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I pull up an Android application, let's see, which one should I use? So all of this stuff, you see this comes from the Android SDK. So this is perfectly acceptable. These things are not third-party libraries. So that's kind of a clear example there. And then we have obviously the tools of the language, like we're using Lambda expressions because this is Java 8+. So those things are definitely not third-party. Now we'll talk about third-party libraries and frameworks. Now, before I proceed, I need to tell you something important. Not everyone agrees about these definitions. So what I'm going to try to do for you here is I'll give you a way of thinking about it, but don't assume that my definitions are correct. I will define them for the purposes of this lesson, and hopefully you will use those working definitions, but just understand some people might say that's not what I think a framework is or a library, and I don't really care. There's no real consensus here. Okay, so let's start with an example of a library. So a library, let's see here, is some collection of source code which you can plug into your source code, so we're talking about your projects, to solve a problem. So this is a very generalized definition. It's something that somebody else wrote, or maybe you wrote in a different program, and the idea is that you can just plug it in and play. Now, it's important to understand the stuff that comes from, for example, the Android SDK. These are still libraries, so we need to understand that a key distinction here is the third party. Now, that hopefully is fairly unambiguous, and if we want to think of some kind of example, well, here I have the recycler view library. It's not part of the plain Android SDK, so it is technically third party using my working definitions, even though it's made by the Android team, and it exists to solve a particular problem. And so in this particular case, the problem we're solving is that we have large list views and we want to implement the view holder pattern. And so we'll talk about this example again later, but this is kind of an example. This is an example of a library. Now we need to contrast that with a framework. So a framework, as the name implies, is a kind of library. So here's an important point. A framework is a library, but a library isn't, not all libraries are frameworks, if you follow my definitions here. So a framework, as the name implies, is a kind of library which is a fundamental part of your application's function and architecture in particular. So in order to kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about here, let's kind of look at an example. So we can kind of think of as a library, like the recycler view. In this case, it's just some particular problem in the structure of a program, whereas a framework, we're thinking about something more like this. You build around it. So again, just to reiterate, understand that a framework is technically a library, in my opinion. It's included in that type, that class. It's a subclass of library if we want to use some programming jargon. But not all libraries are frameworks. Now let's look at a code example to demonstrate this point. So here I have a really old application. This is from like 2016 or something, maybe, no, 2017. And all I want to show you here about why I'm saying this thing is like a major architectural part of your application is in this application here, I used to use RxJava all the time. Now, if I look at a front-end class, so here we have, or sorry, that's the wrong one. If I look at a front-end class like a presenter, and don't use this code as an example, I was a much crappier developer back then. But here we have already we have our RxJava stuff. You can see it's implemented here through the libraries. And we're using Flowable, and we're using all kinds of RxJava stuff. And then if I jump into the very other end of the application, again, we see the usage of RxJava. So the important distinction here is we basically see often an end-to-end structure which you use to build your application. So hopefully that makes sense for people, and that's kind of how I think of a framework versus a library. But again, not everybody agrees.